What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Orange Crushing It podcast, a Jenks Island production. I'm your host, Ty McGee, and in today's episode, we're going to be covering the other half of the free agent targets. If you checked out the last video, I covered the running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends, so all the offensive side of the football. This episode, we'll be covering the defensive side with some of the linebackers and D-line targets, with some of those guys that, Alex Singleton, Justin Strnad, and JFM all hitting free agency, and us needing to replace them to add to this already elite defense. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the other free agent and trade rumors, and then some of the re-signings that we've seen over the past week pretty much since the last episode. So just to kick it off real quick, we're going to jump into the linebackers. There's a couple guys that I could see us going after, even, past this, 5-person list. A name that just came out right before I started recording this was Zaire Franklin. He is a trade target. The Colts are looking to get rid of him for, some cap relief. Maybe a late round pick could get him. He only has an $8 million cap hit. So he has been an all-pro guy, a Pro Bowl guy, a ton of tackles. He's pretty good in coverage. I think that would be, a solid addition to this defense if Denver was willing to enter the trade market, which they've shown the willingness to do so with attempting to trade for David Montgomery just a few days ago before Houston came in and beat them on that trade. The other guy would be Alex Singleton, right? I go back and forth on Singleton because I think he's a true leader. He's obviously awesome in the run game, but he is a bit of a liability in the pass game. He just doesn't bring, that next level coverage ability that, we kind of need. Greenlaw, he's up and down with his health. But even at full health, right, it's always better to have two linebackers that can cover because Singleton has gotten exposed in many occasions in pass coverage. So especially, Jonathan Taylor, if you guys remember the Colts game, absolutely abused him on, wheel route and a couple other routes. So we need to, kind of make this defense, as I've talked about in the past, an all-time great level defense, one of the best in the NFL. Seattle didn't settle, and they ended up in the Super Bowl, with making an addition in Ernest Jones. So we need to do that and add a guy next to Dre Greenlaw that can be a real difference maker. So this is my group of five that I think, really from top to bottom would add something that we didn't have last year. And number one would be Devin Lloyd, right? I think he kind of speaks for himself, but, 81 tackles, 1.5 sacks last season, and 5 interceptions. The 5 interceptions is the biggest piece for me because not only was he the third highest graded linebacker in all the NFL, he was the third highest ranked pass coverage linebacker in the NFL. So this is a guy that adds that piece to this defense that you desperately need, right? That pass coverage ability, the ability to take the football away in the pass game, covering tight ends, covering running backs. I'm sure this is a guy that has covered slot guys as well at times, but he is a primarily tight end and running back cover guy, and he's done a great job at that. Had a really big year this past year, like I mentioned, and kind of stepped up. And you saw the Jacksonville defense, kind of go with him, right? And come and go with him. When he went down with injury, they didn't look as good at times. So I think he'd be an awesome addition. He's probably going to be in that higher range of all these linebackers, maybe the top paid linebacker. So, you kind of got to think of this in the sense of, is Denver going to make a splash on the offensive or defensive side, right? There's room to make a move at both positions, on both sides of the football if you restructure a ton. But if you don't restructure a ton, you're probably limited to one. And, maybe that would just be Kenneth Walker, and you would go with, something more familiar or in a lower price range than Devin Lloyd. But, this is this is what we should be aiming for, right? This is the cream of the crop. This is how you make your defense amazing, right? Just like we saw in 2015 when they went out and added a bunch of those guys like DeMarcus Ware and TJ Ward and Aqib Talib that made this defense, one of the best of all time. So I think Devin Lloyd is an easy target, and he's probably everyone's top target at the linebacker position. And number two is a guy that I've talked a little bit about over on my TikTok, Nakobe Dean. He is an awesome blitzer, would bring a ton of, what Vance Joseph loves to do. He finished last season in only 10 games with 55 tackles, 4 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles, right? And if you just turn on the tape or go watch the TikTok that I posted, there's tons of, just awesome clips of him blitzing. And he's just, would be what Vance Joseph wants to do, show 6 guys up, right, with your 4 defensive linemen, and your two linebackers, or, whatever that may be, showing safeties, corners, but showing a loaded front where you can drop guys out. And Dean has that ability to kind of do both. He's not as good of a pass covering linebacker as Devin Lloyd, but he's surely an upgrade over what we saw last season. I think he's more capable in space, very quick for his size. He's a thicker guy. But I think that, this is a guy that is exactly what Vance Joseph would want. Devin Lloyd's also a great blitzer. But, Nakobe Dean, I think, is just a little bit better from that interior position coming as a blitzing linebacker. So he's also a guy that has said he would love to play for the Denver Broncos if things did not work out for Philadelphia. So the interest is definitely there. The third guy on this list would be Caden Ellis out of Atlanta. He's a guy that played under Sean Payton in New Orleans. Obviously, his brother Jonah Ellis plays for the Denver Broncos as well. So there's that connection. Their dad was also a Denver Bronco. Lots of family ties there, lots of, ties with the coaching staff as well. But this is a guy, I feel like he's just kind of gone under the radar a ton. I finished with 107 tackles last year, 3.5 sacks. I think he's a little bit more capable in space than Alex Singleton would be, and I think that's why he's on this list for me, because I think Singleton is awesome in the run game, right? But I think, like I said, the liability and pass coverage is why we need to move on from him. And I think Caden Ellis shows a little bit more of that ability to move in space. And he's just got a familiarity with a lot of the things on the team. So it's an obvious connection there. And I don't think he would, garner too big of a contract where Alex Singleton, we're talking about giving him a pay raise from $6 million. What does that look like? Is that 8? Is that 10? 8's what Zaire Franklin's getting right now. I imagine they'd probably try to push to 10. I don't love that for that guy. I don't love it. And so I think Caden Ellis would bring some of those things that he wouldn't bring it at an elite level or high level. He's never had a 70 pass coverage grade on PFF, but, still a better pass cover guy than Singleton was this past season and has been for the past couple years. The fourth guy on this list will be Demario Davis, who, he's getting a little bit older. He's 37 years old now. But he's still producing at such a high level, 143 tackles this past season, and the 6th highest graded linebacker in the NFL. Obviously a saint this past season, but a saint under Sean Payton as well. This is a guy that would, again, be familiar with, with the coaching staff. I think that's going to be kind of a big theme that we'll see, with some of these linebackers and defensive linemen, is that there's a lot of carryover from the Sean Payton kind of tenure in New Orleans. I think just because we're looking for some more bang for your buck guys on the defensive side, if we're not going to get, the big splash like a Devin Lloyd or a Nakobe Dean, guys just that would have familiarity, that can, have proven themselves and have performed really well, but would garner, a lesser contract. So I think Demario, he'd come in, he'd provide a ton of, veteran experience. You can still draft and probably would draft a guy in the 2nd or 3rd round, or even if you just have, kind of him mentor like a guy like Drew Sanders, if he can stay healthy. But I think if you add Demario, I'd love to draft a linebacker in the 2nd round, like a Jacob Rodriguez, where Demario could maybe, just take him under his wing for a year, provide a ton of value to the Denver defense on like a 1-year, $6 million deal. And this would be, he'd provide everything that Alex Singleton's providing in the run game, where, ton of tackles, really just eats everything up. But I still think even at 37 years old, he brings a little bit more in the pass game, and his younger age, of course, he was one of the best linebackers in the NFL, still is, but I think, he's obviously slowing down a little bit. I still think he brings more than Singleton does in the pass game. And the last one would be Justin Strnad. He obviously was the backup to Singleton. They kind of rotated at times. He rotated with Greenlaw. But when you saw Justin Strnad and Dre Greenlaw on the field at the same time, the efficiency in the overall defense went up. If you look at some of the more advanced metrics, Strnad, better in coverage, was still good in the run game. He had a high understanding of this defense because he's been around for a really, really long time. He's kind of one of those gritty guys too, plays special teams. You love to see that out of your linebacker, a guy that, kind of works his way up through the special teams ranks and then earns that starting job. The tough thing with him is he doesn't want to come back if he's not a starter. And so that's why I have him on here above Alex Singleton. If you could have them both back and not beat Singleton out in camp, that'd be awesome. But you can't allocate the amount of money that Singleton and Strnad want to the linebacker position with some of the other needs that we have and the potential for splashes on the offensive side. So I think Sternad would make more sense to bring him back, just as a guy who's been around, understands the organization, is a veteran leader, and is all those things that Alex Singleton is, but just a little bit better in pass coverage. So this is the 5 guys I think that I would really target at the linebacker position. Obviously, with Zaire Franklin, information coming out that he could possibly be available in trade. Maybe I'd probably put him right above Caden Ellis because he already has a contract established at $8 million. Right, Caden might get a little bit more than that. I don't quite know what his market will be like, but if it's north of that, I'd like Zaire. If you can get him for a 5th round pick, a 4th round pick, I think a 5th may be reasonable because they're trying to shed some cap space so that they can bring back Alec Pierce and lock up Daniel Jones. So to get an all-pro linebacker, a Pro Bowl level linebacker for that late of a pick, I think that'd be awesome. But those big 3 of Lloyd, Dean, and Ellis are definitely guys that I want to see Denver, go after and target on day 1 or day 2 of free agency. Moving on from the linebacker position into the interior defensive line position, the big guy is going to be JFM. I would love to have JFM back. I don't think that it's going to happen. I think he's kind of outpriced us at this point in time. And maybe there's some friction, because we didn't extend him earlier. He's obviously been an awesome player for us on the interior. We got him for a good bargain too. I think it was a early day 3 pick or a late day 2 pick from the New York Jets on draft day. It's panned out really well for us, but I think it's just not going to work out because of the money. So you look at some of the guys around him, right? And there's a lot of connections to, Sean Payton and his New Orleans Saints days, or in the case of Calais Campbell, the Denver Broncos, and just the state of Colorado. So the number 2 guy, I would have Sheldon Rankins. I think Rankins, he took a big step up in the Houston Texans defense last year, only finished with 3 sacks, but he had a ton of pressures and just, was a real difference maker for this defense, was a part of something that, that was one of the best defenses in the NFL. They really just flew around. And I think him going from Houston to Denver, it would be a lot of the same, a lot of familiarity, obviously, like I mentioned, with the coaching staff, but just familiarity with like having, dogs around you, right? They have 2 dogs on the edge, and Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter. We got that in Coop and Benito. And I think we got a better guy on the interior, Zach Allen, that would free up Rankins to have even more opportunities to get some more sacks. So I think this is a guy that, he might get a decent payday, but it's going to be less than JFM and could provide just a ton of value on the interior defensive line for you. So that'd probably be my number 1 guy that I think Denver should go out and look for a replacement for JFM if it's not for the draft. Obviously, I've been very vocal about Denver going out and adding someone through the draft. Maybe that's Lee Hunter, maybe that's Caleb Banks. But if you're going to look to add a veteran guy, I think Sheldon Rankins, you could do a lot worse than him. At number 3, I'd have Cam Jordan. He's another guy like Demario Davis that is getting older, and I think, is losing some of that, explosiveness. So you move him to the interior. He still had 10.5 sacks last year, but I think a move to the interior for him, he's a bigger guy, would be awesome, especially like I mentioned with Rankins. He's got a bunch of dogs around him, so it makes this guy's job a lot easier. He was kind of the number 1 guy in New Orleans. They had, Carl Granderson and Brian Bresee over the past couple of years who have taken steps up at times, but 10.5 sacks at his age, I believe he's 37 as well, or he's up there at least. But, he would be just a real veteran presence for you. I think you could go out and take a defensive lineman in the 3rd or 4th round, or maybe bank on Savion Jones, kind of taking a step up. And Cam Jordan could just provide a ton of value. Obviously him and Demario Davis at older ages performed really, really well on I'll say it, a bad team. Sorry, Jenks, sorry, STERB, but, the Saints were a bad team last year for most of the season. Obviously, they finished pretty strong, but defensively, not great. So I think he was a bright spot for them, and he'd be an awesome ad. And maybe he would take a discounted, he'd take a pay cut so that he could come into Denver, play with Sean Payton, play on an awesome defense, and go chase a ring. So I think Cam Jordan would be my number 3 guy, moving him into the interior. And number 4, another former New Orleans Saint, David Onyemata. He didn't have as good of a year this past year. He finished with a career high in tackles, but only 1 sack. That defense was kind of led by a lot of their guys on the edge with Jalen Walker and James Pierce Jr. I almost blanked on his name. But David Onyemata, I think maybe he's tilting towards the latter half of his career, but maybe he could have a rejuvenation in the Denver defense. Like I said, it makes your job as that second defensive tackle so much easier when you're playing next to Zach Allen because he garners so much attention. Not to take anything away from JFM because he was obviously awesome in a lot of situations, and it made offensive lines not know who the hell they were going to double team on the interior. But Onyemata, in one-on-one situations, I think he could get more than one win, like he did this past season. So I wouldn't mind him as an ad. He'd probably be a lesser contract, maybe a 1 or 2 year deal for a couple $1 million and still go out and add a guy like Lee Hunter or Caleb Banks. And the last guy would just be Calais Campbell. This is a guy that has flirted with Denver over the years. He's from Colorado. I think he's really old. He's like 40 years old at this point in time. And he's probably nothing more than a veteran presence and maybe a rotational pass rusher. But I think you could get him for cheap. I think he would probably love to come back to Denver. And, if he decides to continue playing, of course. But I think, the veteran leadership, right, is something that you can never have too much veteran leadership on a defense. Obviously, we're not the youngest defense in the league. We've got guys in their mid-20s that have been playing for a bit now under, Vance Joseph. But I think Calais Campbell could bring that veteran leadership and just go out and try to chase a ring for him. So I think, he would provide a little bit of situational pass rush, but mostly, just be an older vet for us in that locker room for, 1 year, $3 million or something like that. So those are the 5 defensive linemen I think I would target. Like I said, I think mostly the draft is where I'd want to see. At 30, I'd love to see Caleb Banks or Lee Hunter if we cannot bring back JFM, but would not hate to see a guy like Sheldon Rankins in the orange and blue this year with the guys around him. So that's it for my defensive, free agent targets. I think, outside of that, safety and corner, as positions of need, corner, obviously, not really a need at all. We're very, very deep there. Safety, you could use some depth, but I think I'd prefer to go after that in the draft. Obviously, I've talked about Bishop Fitzgerald and Kamari Ramsey as guys with Doug Belk coming in from USC. I think there's a lot of familiarity there. So they would both be great ads behind 2, veteran safeties that have had some injury history as well. But moving on to some of the free agent and trade rumors. One of the trade rumors that came out within the last couple of days is Jarrett Stidham. Apparently there's some interest around the league for him. Is the smoke? Is it real? Allegedly the Jets may have some interest in him. I think that kind of depends on, do they fall flat in going after a guy like Kyler Murray? Do they fall flat in some of these other veterans that are going to hit the market? Stidham, obviously, there is, he's had some starting experience in the past. He didn't look great in the AFC Championship game, albeit it was the first start and it was, the 20th week of the season at that point in time against the team that ended up going to the Super Bowl, a really good defense in a snow game. So I think, maybe there's a little bit more improvement there, but he could just be a veteran guy for maybe if they go after Ty Simpson or someone else that's a bit younger, kind of like he was for Bo. He pushed Bo in the preseason. They were both competing for that starting job. Bo obviously won it, and Stidham has just been around as kind of that veteran leader who's been, in some situations where he was in New England behind Tom Brady. He's obviously been a starter. He's been in multiple different coaching staffs. So he brings, a lot of veteran leadership. I think you probably at most get maybe a 6th round pick. If you can get a 5th, that's amazing. It's probably like a 6 and maybe a 7th round pick swap. But I think any draft capital you can get for your backup quarterback, and maybe you just ride with Sam Ehlinger as your backup for next season as your QB2. I think that'd be a solid move because you don't, outside of the injury that happened to Bo, you're not looking to bench him. You're not looking to move on from him. So your backup is important, but we saw that Stidham really wasn't able to do much for us. He had that one drive, and then outside of that, it wasn't much. So I'd be okay with it, especially because of the cap savings there as well. The other free agent and trade news that came out was that, we're looking to make a splash at the running back position. I mentioned this in my last episode. We need to make a splash on the offensive side, and it kind of all arrows are pointing at Kenneth Walker being that splash move. All the rumors are that Denver's interested in him. The rumors are that we're looking for a running back. I think that everything there just kind of aligns. And like I mentioned in the last episode, he just would bring so much to this offense that, we had but we lost with J.K. Dobbins down, and we just can't risk it again, going with another guy that's going to be injury prone like J.K. again. We can't have J.K. come back and then miss a ton of time. We need to bring in a guy like Kenneth Walker, who has missed some time in his career, but played all 17 games last season and really, showed out in a big way and could be an awesome back for us between the tackles, outside the tackles, and in the passing game as well. So he kind of brings it all and would bring a new element to this offense. Outside of that, no other free agency and trade rumors at the time. Only 2 re-signings. Jaquan McMillan got the second-round tender, and that's why I mentioned, we don't need to go after a cornerback. We have him, we have Pat, we have Riley, we have Cad, and we have Jahdae Barron. So that room is loaded. I wouldn't even consider looking at a corner unless he's a special teams guy at your 6th corner spot. But even then, I think that there's other ways that we could spend our money because this room is so loaded, and the top is very heavy. And so a guy like Cad is only going to get in if there's an injury that happens like last year with Pat Surtain. So he's going to be a special team guy as well. The other one that came out today, Alex Bachewski signed a 2-year deal. So kind of fuels what I was saying also in the last episode, where Ben Powers, the trade rumors, can we trade him? Will we trade him? The cap space that we would gain from that is pretty big. And so with Bachewski signing that 2-year deal, I don't know the exact dollar amount yet, but I can't imagine it's anything too big because he only has, I think, 9 starts under his belt. But he, played awesome last year in replacement of Ben Powers, garnered an all-pro vote, one of 7 guards to garner an all-pro vote as well, which is very impressive for a guy who just stepped in and barely played like half the season. And first time playing at left guard as well. Mostly he's played on the right side in his career, been like a swing tackle. So he stepped in an amazing way, and I think we can now move on from Ben Powers, and that's where the money comes for Kenneth Walker, right? If you're going to make a splash for a running back, you got to clear up a little bit more cap space. I didn't think that Ben Powers trade could do that. And, if you cut him, I think that's fine too. But if you can trade him and get some more capital, same thing I said with Jarrett Stidham, right? If you can get a late pick and take some shots on guys or maybe use that as ammunition to move up, I obviously love that as a move for the Denver Broncos. Last 2 things not on the list. Wearing my Colorado Rockies hat. This is in kind of solidarity with some of the Rockies fans. A lot of fans, including myself, when the Waltons bought the Denver Broncos, thought maybe the Colorado Rockies could be another team that they would buy. Obviously, his family members, the Kroenkes, own just about every other thing in Denver, Colorado. And, Walton has a ton of money. The Rockies, ownership group, no one loves them. The Mumfords have been terrible in their entire tenure, failed to spend any money on the team. And the Waltons, they bought a 10% stake in the Arizona Diamondbacks. So, hate to see it because I was really hopeful that they would buy the Colorado Rockies and we would turn some things around. And, we would have 4 competitive teams, just like we have the Rockies that are a bad team, but the Avs, the Nuggets, and the Broncos, all super duper competitive right now. It just sucks to see that our baseball team is basically a waste of space out there. Coors Field's beautiful. The team that plays in it, not so beautiful, but they got some cool hats. So, and the last thing, Bo Nix and Izzy had their baby. So, congrats to Bo Nix. If he ever sees this, congrats, young buck. But, exciting stuff going on. Free agency starts up this coming week. On Monday is when the legal tampering period opens. And then Wednesday is officially when free agency starts. So I'm excited to see, are there a couple moves over the next couple of days? Do we trade Ben Powers, Jarrett Stidham? Are there other guys that maybe we go get Zaire Franklin? I don't know what the right guard position looks like in Indianapolis off the top of my head. Obviously, they have Quentin Nelson, but maybe you flip Ben over there. Actually, no, that wouldn't make sense because they are looking to cut some cap space. But send a 5th-round pick for Zaire Franklin. Send Ben Powers out for a 5th or 6th-round pick. I think both would be great moves. Hopefully that we see over the next couple of days. But that'll do it for this episode. Make sure you keep an eye out for all the other podcasts that we're dropping. The tight end video just dropped on Jenks Island the other day. There's a free agency video coming out tomorrow with some of our predictions for the top guys hitting the free agent class. And obviously that's continuing to evolve as we see more guys like Stephon Diggs get released. But, a lot of good content going on over there. Make sure you check out my Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at orange_crushing it. And I will see you guys next time.